Hey guys, Redneck Mini 14 here, and today I'm going to take you through the lineage of my favorite semi-automatic action out there, the Garand style action. This is not all of the guns that the Garand style action was used on, but it is most of them, at least as far as my knowledge goes. Starts with the M1 Garand, and then later into the M1 Carbine, and then the M14, M1A I don't have, and then of course the Mini 14 and Mini 30. There was one more, the BM59 I think, which is I think that's an Italian version of the M1 Garand, but it's more like an M14. That's not very common compared to all these other guns, so we're just going to talk about these four, and I'm also going to talk about the M14. Now, this is not going to be a full history lesson on the action, but just kind of an illustration on how the action works and how it evolved over time. So we'll start with the M1 Garand. Back in the 1930s, essentially after World War I, the United States was looking to increase its abilities and its firepower compared to just a 5-shot bolt action, which was the dominant small arm at the time for all countries. So, you have the 1903 Springfield for the United States, the Enfield rifles for Great Britain, and then of course you had the M1 Garand, and then the Mauser for all those other European nations. But in the 1930s, the United States was looking to increase its firepower, so they held trials for the next great American rifle for the military. And so they settled on the M1 Garand. It was it was designed by John Garand, and that's kind of a big controversy on whether or not the gun is called a Garand or if it's a Garand. That's a topic for another video. And he designed a pretty good and pretty clever design. So, you have this big rotating bolt up here, which is connected to the op rod, which goes all the way along the bottom of the rifle. And it does not take magazines, it takes end block clips. This is one of the only guns that you can say is clip fed, even though it is still technically magazine fed, but the clip is what you actually put into the rifle, not a magazine. So that's kind of interesting. You do have a fully adjustable rear peep sight and then a winged post in the front. And that's the M1 Garand. Again, I said it took end block clips. These are 8-round end block clips, 30-06. The idea was that magazines are more expensive, and they're just another thing that a soldier's going to drop. So they didn't want to go the more expensive route of a magazine. They decided to go the cheap route and use these end block clips. So that's kind of interesting. It's also interesting to note that the M1 Garand was originally designed to shoot a round called 276 Pedersen, which I imagine was designed by John Pedersen, which was kind of an underappreciated gun designer at the time, kind of always living in John Browning's shadow. But anyway, I digress. So the way that the M1 Garand works is you have your round in your chamber, you pull the trigger, and the round, or the bullet, and the gases go all the way down the barrel, and they hit the gas block, and the gases push back the op rod. The op rod is this handle here, and it goes underneath the rifle, and it goes all the way up into this tube, and the gases push it back and push the charging handle back and the bolt, and it just strips off the next round on the clip until you shot all 8, and then the clip will shoot out, the action will stay open, and you can load your next clip. So that's a pretty clever design. It's also clever the way the magazine actually works. The recoil spring in the op rod is actually the same spring used in the magazines, so you don't have a separate spring in here. All of the springs basically in this rifle are just the one recoil spring, other than the springs in the trigger mechanism. So that's back in 1936 when the M1 Garand first came into being. This is before World War II started, and we already had our new rifle to be used in war when it needed to be used. So fast forward to the 1940s, 1942 to be exact, and we're in the war, and there is a need for a smaller rifle, or carbine, whatever you want to call it. So the M1 Garand is a very, very heavy rifle, and not all soldiers need a full-size rifle shooting a full-size round. So the United States decided that they wanted to get a smaller rifle or carbine and replace the 1911 as the gun of choice for certain troops. And so they ended up with the M1 carbine, which shoots the .30 carbine. Now, with all of these guns, the M1 carbine is kind of the odd man out on multiple levels. So, we just pick it up here. Of course, you have a much smaller action. This is not an actual M1 carbine. This is a reproduction, universal reproduction. But as you can see, you have the same style of action. You have this bolt. It is significantly smaller. Open top bolt with an op rod. But the difference is you do not have a gas tube that goes out. Instead, you have a short stroke piston inside the stock here on the gas block underneath here, and the piston is only shoots out about that much when the gun is fired, and that little bit is enough to work the entire action, which is kind of cool. So instead of the whole op rod being one whole piece, as being the piston, if you know what I mean, you have a small piston that pushes back the op rod. So the gases don't directly push back the op rod. So that's the difference there. And also, you have a difference in the feeding system. So instead of using end block clips, they decided to go with the magazine fed system, and you have a push button magazine release here, and of course you have a different style of safety. You either had a push button safety or you had a toggle safety instead of the blade safety, which is also known as the Garand style safety. So that's one difference. It did have a capacity of 15 rounds when it started out, which is like double of what the M1 Garand had. So you have 15 plus 1, so with a maximum of 16 instead of 8. And there really is no topping off an M1 Garand either. That's another thing to keep in mind. With the M2 and M3s, which came later, they also had 30-round magazines as well. And also with the M2 and M3s, you had full auto capabilities. The M1 was just semi-auto, as was the M1 Garand. So, moving on down the line, back in the 1950s, in fact I think it was 1959, the United States was looking to replace both of these rifles and just replace it with one rifle that was kind of in between. So, in a way, they combined the two rifles to make the M14. So, it looked more like an M1 Garand. It had a slightly shorter barrel. The gas tube and gas system was more like it was kind of a combination of both. So you did have a gas tube that shot out the end of the stock, but not quite as far. And also the stock, this front end essentially here was not there. You just had an elongated stock. So the M1 Garand is a 3-piece stock. It essentially took it from a 3-piece to a 2-piece. And they also added a flash hider, which was like really long flash hiders, like, you know, this big, like 2-3 inches. something like that, whereas these two guns here did not have a flash hider or a flash suppressor. Instead of a, I don't even know what you would really call this style of gas system. It's not, I guess it's kind of direct impingement, but it's also kind of a piston-driven system as well. So instead of this style of a system, it's the gas system's more like this, where you have a piston, although the piston was significantly longer. Instead of a piston this size, it was a piston about this size, which was held in the gas tube underneath the barrel, and that is what drove the op rod of the M14. The M14 was also full auto capable, and it shot the 308 7.62 by 51, which is basically a 30-06 short, which was more reliable. But of course, the M14 was still a very heavy rifle. In fact, I'm not sure, it might be heavier than the M1 Garand. It does have more capacity, it does have full auto capability, but it was still a very heavy rifle, and it really wasn't, in my opinion, a very good replacement for the M1 carbine, but it was a pretty good replacement for the M1 Garand. So fast forward into the Vietnam era, the military was looking at another rifle to replace the M14, which the M14 is still in use today, but not in large numbers. So one company that decided to test out a gun for the United States military was Ruger. And they basically took the M14 and made it a Mini 14. So you still have the same M1 style action. You have that big open top bolt there with the op rod. Gas system is slightly different than the M14 and M1 Garand. This is a Mini 30, by the way. But your gas system is essentially, it's more like an M1 Garand. So you have your op rod, which only goes this far down into the receiver, as opposed to going all the way to the end of the barrel. So the gases get pushed up here to the gas block and go through a little fixed piston down here, which push the op rod back instead of being all the way out there. So it is a lighter rifle. It does shoot a lighter round. The Mini 14 shot the 5.56 NATO and the 223 Remington. This is 223 Remington right here. But this is the round that the United States military was looking to use back in the 60s and 70s. So Ruger came up with the Mini 14. I don't have a first generation Mini 14, but this is a second generation, essentially, Mini 14 or Mini 30. And then, you know, this one has flip-up sights and a single blade front sight post, and it also has a pencil barrel. So the original Mini 14s, they weren't so great. They were very, you know, they're very reliable rifles. They are very reminiscent of the original M1 Garand and M14. You still have your safeties down here in the trigger guard, as opposed to a push button or something else. You still have adjustable peep sights, although the original peep sights for the M1 or the M14s were probably the best. You know, they went from a sight more like the M1 Garand and then changed it to this flip up, which isn't really that good. And then from the flip up, they went to this other style sight here. But long story short, the US military did not go with the Ruger Mini 14. They instead went with the AR-15 style platform and the M16 and, you know, all those styles of rifles. So Ruger just decided to make the Mini 14 a commercial rifle. And it was a very big success. It was a very big success among law enforcement and small game hunters and just people who wanted guns and who like to shoot in general. It's a very reliable gun. Not necessarily the most accurate gun because of this pencil barrel and just the overall design of the rifle. It's not that accurate of a gun, especially the original ones. but it's still a very reliable gun. So fast forward to the 80s, 1986 to be exact, Ruger had their 5.56 223 version, but they decided to throw in another caliber into the mix with the 7.62 by 39, and they came up with the Ruger Mini 30. So it took the same ammunition that the AK and the SKS and all those guns take, but in an Americanized rifle, in a very classic style of rifle. So that's when they came up with the Mini 30. It's essentially the same exact rifle as the Mini 14, just in a different caliber. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and Ruger finally decided to address the accuracy issue with the Mini 14 rifle and the Mini 30. In 2004, 2005, they made some upgrades. So essentially there are three main generations of Mini 14. There was the 180 series, which I do not have, the 181 to like 197 or something, which is what this is, this Mini 30, and then they have the 580 series, which is what this one is here. So with the 580 series, you have a slightly thicker barrel, you have a some upgraded sights, you have an adjustable rear sight, and a winged front post. I'll show you guys that here. So you have an adjustable rear sight. It's adjustable with tools, not with your hands, unfortunately. And of course you have your protected front sight, which is definitely an upgrade from the older Mini 14s. But other than that, the guns are pretty much the same. I do think on all, I'm not sure about all, but most Mini 14s now, your trigger and your hammer are stainless steel, whereas all the older ones had just blued steel unless it was a stainless gun. But there are, just a few different changes like that. It's essentially the same gun with just a few changes. And it's still in production today, and it's still a good rifle. So anyway, that's the lineage of the M1 Garand. Basically you have the granddaddy, the distant cousin, the M14 or M1A would be the daddy, and then the Mini 14 and Mini 30 are the brothers, essentially, the sons. So it's kind of interesting looking at almost the entire family of M1 style rifles. And I would like to get an M14, or not an M14, but an M1A one of these days, but I just don't have the funds for it. But alas, I do have these four, and they're good rifles. They're never going to leave my possession until the day I die, so that's just the way I feel about that. Subscribe to my channel, like me on Facebook. I'm Redneck Mini 14, and until next time, be safe.